Hey Mike, this is my reflection video for the difficult conversation we were to have this week. I don't really know where to start. I guess I'm gonna start with the fact that the conversation got a lot easier, like you had said, so you're right there. The content though didn't. It's still heavy stuff. It's still kind of hard for me to talk about it, and I know it's going to take a lot more conversations to kind of get used to it, but yeah, it was a little bit hefty, to say the least. The conversation that I had was kind of surrounding the Colten Boushie trial, and the person that I was speaking with obviously sides with Gerald Stanley instead of Boushie. And so the conversation we had was kind of trying to understand different points of view and understand like the systemic racism behind the judge's decision and all of the factors that lead up to that. And I think one of the main points that we had in our conversation had to do with relationships and reconciliation. So my biggest point was we can't ease this tension in Saskatchewan or in Canada and in our school systems and anywhere really if we don't break down this wall of whiteness and privilege and power that we have and actually get to know them, hear their stories and everything. And it's really hard for us to actually have a relationship with them because we just have these ideas and these stereotypes about them, and it's just like if one person does one thing, then we brand the entire Aboriginal population as that person, despite us never doing that to a white person who, let's say, shoots up a church or anything, just like that happened in the past couple of years. It seems that we only ever brand one person of color and then use that person as an example or as the norm for their entire group or people. And so relationships, we can't achieve reconciliation or justice, and we can't have a good positive relationship without acknowledging and listening to them and knowing a different side of the story or a different perspective. And I think we won't be able to do that unless we just shut up and listen. And the person who I was speaking with raised the point that we've tried already and we're past that point and they should just get over it, whatever it is they're complaining about now, because it's sickening. And this was a point they raised because there was obviously protests going on after the trial. And there was a lot of Indigenous people who were coming forward on social media and on the news and everything, talking about, like, this is our experience. This is the life of an Indigenous person. And it was, I understood where they were coming from, obviously, but the person I was speaking to wasn't, and it was really sad to see that. So, they didn't understand, they didn't see, and no matter how many facts I would raise, it was just, oh, well, what about this? What about that? And one of my other big points was that Indigenous people are living in a society where they've literally been where our society's been like structured to hold them at a disadvantage. They grew up in the residential school system for that lasted 100 and some years, give or take, and that's caused intergenerational trauma and all of this nasty consequences that obviously the Canadian government was hoping for when they made the purpose of residential schools to kill the Indian and the child. And it's really, it's sad knowing that this is like the reality, and a lot of people don't understand that. And it's even sadder to know that despite a lot of people knowing about residential schools and knowing that a lot of Indigenous people went through are held at a disadvantage, and the government has structured it that way for a reason, is just, it's frustrating. Because the main response people who don't understand an Aboriginal person's point of view is that, why don't they just get over it? And this is something I hear every damn time. And why don't they just get over it? Or they have other privileges. They get free school. They don't pay taxes. They get free houses. They get reserves. They get whatever. And it's really, really hard, because no matter how many times you can say this, we have privileges too. We are given, if like just as much, if not more, privileges than Aboriginal people, and we can assume that those are privileges for them, but they're like, it's not. And a lot of them are just, it's not even, they're not even true. It's just bullshit. So it's just, the conversation went difficult. But there was 3 things I kind of took from this, because this is and has been an ongoing topic of conversation I've been having with this person and other people in my family for, I want to say, years. And it's, I don't think it ever gets any harder, because no matter how many things you know or how emotional or passionate you feel about this topic, like they don't understand. And so for me, one of my biggest realizations or learnings from this conversation was that no matter how much you think you may know, there's always another side or perspective. So I thought that would be the person I was speaking to. Like, they should, no matter how much they think they know, they should consider something else or consider a new perspective. And it was really hard for them, or it was really hard for me to see that they, like, their refusal to do that. And I think that's what made this conversation partially so difficult. But yeah, so there's always another side of the story, and no matter how much you know, there's always a different perspective. You can't always reach that person. Like, sometimes people just argue just to argue. Some people have such a hate for a specific group of people. Some people are genuinely stubborn, or some people are educated by the wrong people, and there's just no getting to them. I think that was one of the biggest things I took from this. The second one I took was something I realized quite a while ago, but was reinforced after I had this conversation. And it's like, me as a teacher, I have the power to shape my students' thoughts, their worldview, their identity, the way they see the world, the way they interact with people, because I have such an influence on their learning. And so for me, I think partially my role as a teacher is to share or use my power and show them empathy, show them perspective, and show them a new way of thinking, because education goes a long way. I mean, I'm an example. I grew up really racist. I grew up in a really racist family. I had these racist thoughts and concepts about people of, I guess, people of color. And it wasn't until university, until I started reading, until I started having these difficult conversations and actually looking at the news, looking at history, that I changed. I understand. Obviously, there's a long way for me to go, and I could learn a whole lot more. And I definitely want to learn the experience of others, but I think I understand now. And so for me, that's I think is one of my big roles. It's not telling them that their opinion is wrong and whatever, because I'm pretty sure that's not what you're supposed to be doing unless it's absolutely ridiculously racist. But I think, yeah, letting them know, or sharing a specific perspective, or sharing the information for them to form their own understanding from it, because I think that's what'll get to them. And then the third one, I think we briefly touched on it, but I also find it just way too important, and it's also one of the major themes, I guess, that was in my difficult conversation that I had. But there's power in discomfort. The more discomfort I feel, I think, as a white settler, is more comfort to someone who is perhaps Indigenous or is perhaps a person of color. I think the more uncomfortable I am and the more able I am to recognize my roots and unsettle this worldview and this structure of society, makes a more comfortable space for students of all colors. And I think just like this difficult conversation, there's discomfort to it, but this is the process of reconciliation. This is continuing this conversation. It's sharing a voice that doesn't get heard. And I think that's, I guess, that's the third biggest takeaway I took from this. I also kind of thought about how this applies to teaching, because I know that was one of the questions. So, these are conversations that I'm probably going to continue to have, whether it's family members, students, parents, people in the community. But I think it's important to teach this content, and for like the parents and the students that are reluctant to learn this, it's important you continue this, because it makes it contextually relevant. We are in Saskatchewan. We're on Treaty 4 territory. We are all treaty people, and I think everybody, whether you're Indigenous or not, need to learn this. This is our history. I think equipping myself with knowledge and equipping my students with knowledge, factual knowledge, will be able to strengthen this debate, because for some reason this still is a debate. By doing so, you can't argue with the facts, and you can't argue with the experiences that certain Aboriginal people had. These aren't your experiences, these are theirs. And we should be listening. I think it's one of the most important things we can really do. And it's not being done enough. We need to let them share their experience. We need to let their voice be heard. And if their voice isn't going to be heard, we should be using our voice. And I think that's what I'm going to be doing when I become a teacher, is using my voice to let those who aren't heard be heard. And I think with this, and with this view of justice and reconciliation, comes this culturally responsive classroom environment. I know if we look at the social studies curriculum, there isn't very much Indigenous content being integrated. And if it is, it's mostly optional. But I think making it more contextually relevant and culturally responsive means integrating a lot more Indigenous content, not just the white man's perspective, but actually sharing traditional Indigenous stories and stuff like that, because I think that's also a major factor that we need to consider. I think this is important. Like, we should be starting at the schools, I think. And I'm not saying that because having these conversations with adults isn't effective or is stupid or whatever, but I think students are easier to be, like, it's easier to shape students. And I think equipping them with that knowledge will really help. And especially letting them learn a more in-depth view about colonialism and the history of colonialism. And I'm not just talking about residential schools, because I think the moment that we dig deeper than residential schools and start sharing the history before residential schools and even after, I think that's when the learning is going to start. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be learning about residential schools, but I think it's one of the, it's a topic that a lot of teachers jump to just to get some hit the treaty at outcomes or whatever. And I think I'm going to set my students up a lot better if you're sharing more than that. And I think when you do that, you're going deeper than the surface. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. I don't know. Okay, thanks for watching this. I'm sorry it's so long.